so we will get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be collaborating with our friends at NYRB again to welcome Brian Dillon live from London, here to present his new book, Suppose a Sentence, in conversation with Vinson Cunningham. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days. And I want to give a huge thanks to Brian and Vinson for joining us this evening, or a very late evening as it is for Brian. So to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We will try to get through as many as we can by the end of the program. There's also a chat button here at the bottom where I'll be posting a link to purchase tonight's book. So please keep an eye out for that and click and buy. A caveat for tonight's event, we are all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that could arise. We will try to solve them quickly. And we will be continuing our virtual series across all of the fall and into the spring, so please head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I do want to point out, next Thursday, we're pleased to welcome the South African author Ivan Vladislavich to the Zoom stage for a discussion of his new novel, The Distance, in conversation with Peter Godwin. Registrations for that event are live now, so please check it out on our website. So now a little about our authors and we'll get started. Brian was born in Dublin in 1969. His books include The Great Explosion, which was shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize, Objects in This Mirror essays, I Am Sitting in a Room, Sanctuary, Tormented Hope, 9 Hypochondriac Lives, and In the Dark Room. And with New York Review of Books, a book of essays, Essayism. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, and the London Review of Books, among many other places. He is the UK editor of Cabinet Magazine and teaches creative writing at Queen Mary University of London. And Vinson joined The New Yorker as a staff writer in 2016. His writing on books, art, and culture has appeared in the Times Magazine, the Times Book Review, Vulture, The All, Fader, and McSweeney's, where he wrote a column called Field Notes for Gentrified Places. He previously served as staff assistant at the Obama White House and is based in New York City. So Brian and Vinson, the stage is yours.
Brian, it's so great to be here with you.
Thank you so much for doing this, Vinson. It's very nice.
My pleasure. In my darkening living room here. Are you going to read first?
I'm going to read, yeah. I'm going to read a little from the introduction to the book. This is just a couple of paragraphs where I'm saying a few things about what I think or what I hoped I was doing in this book. The truth is, I wanted to write a book that was all positives, all pleasure, only about good things. Beautiful sentences, William Gass wrote, are rare as eclipses. I went chasing eclipses, those moments of reading when the light changes, some darker luster takes over, and things or words seem suddenly obscure, even in the simplest sentence. And you find you have to look twice, more than twice. In 1853, the poet and critic Matthew Arnold proposed what he called literary touchstones, those privileged moments that constitute the best of what has been thought and written, against which the relative worth of other works can be assessed. For good reasons, this is no longer a reputable way to think about literature, the texture of flux and design disappearing in the preservation of mere relics. So, not a treasury then, something closer, I hope, to a kind of commonplace book, product of haphazard notation, ad hoc noticing. Except, of course, it's not that. The raw notebook would be indecipherable and self-involved. And while I very much like the idea of a book made only of quotations, a cento without glosses, notes, or scholium, not even Walter Benjamin, who aspired to something of the sort in his Arcades project, could refrain from commentary and give himself up completely to the dialectic dance of fragments. In each of the 27 pieces that follow, I've tried to describe the affinity I feel for the individual sentence, perhaps also for the work it came from and the writer who composed it, but without my figuring in advance how much analysis, how much context, how much rapture or digression I would include. I wrote, as it were, with my nose to the page, wrote for the first time in my life without a plan of the whole thing in mind. wrote from one fragment to the next, feeling for the route that affinity might take me.
That's lovely. I loved that figure from the beginning of the sort of the commonplace book as a sort of this process of holding on to something for sometimes a long time, sometimes not so long. Sometimes you say, you know, I just found out about this writer, and turning it into art, that process. I want to read one of your sentences to you, because I think that that's also part of what the sentence as a technology does, and you show this so well. There's in a section about a sentence by George Eliot, you say, there's this wonderful metaphor there that like a disease of the retina is sort of the end of this long sentence that maybe we can read in full later, or maybe not. But you say of this particular metaphor, you say, you could say of this medical metaphor, which may have grown over years in the writer's mind or presented itself to her in a flash on considering her journal of 1860, that it's quite of a piece with other aspects of the novel. In other words, that the sentence itself and the parts of the sentence might be the process of a similar process like the one that you're going through yourself. Could you talk about how that process of gestation, and maybe even how you take your notes as a note keeper that produced this book, and how that relates to your idea of the sentence?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the book has a couple of different origins. One of them was that having written my last book, Essayism, I was really unsure what I was going to do next. And my partner, who's a writer, Emily Labarge, said to me, maybe you should write a book about sentences. And within, I suppose, a couple of hours, I had begun to own this idea, this wonderful idea that, of course, I had. And I realized quickly that there was, that I had a resource, I had raw material for a book about sentences. And the raw material is notebooks, and they are here, just out of shot, not on these shelves behind me. About 45 notebooks going back 20 years since I first, I suppose, started to write professionally. And I've always kept in the back of the notebook, there's always the last page is given over to words, new words, odd words, ordinary words that I think might be employed oddly. And the second last page, and sometimes this kind of drifts backwards into the rest of the notebook, is usually given over to sentences and phrases. So I figured I had some kind of resource. And so one of the things I suppose that the book is about is sentences, language, styles, writers, voices that I've been reading and hearing for decades. But the other thing the book is about, and it kind of needed to be about to kind of give myself the impetus to do it, was that it should be about surprise. So over the couple of years that I was writing it, I was trying, or I was forced, I suppose, to kind of to have a different kind of attention to what I was reading, either for pleasure or professionally, for teaching or reviewing or research or whatever, and to have a slightly more, I suppose, kind of naive attitude to what I was reading, to just kind of write things down because I thought, oh, that's odd or fascinating or weird or beautiful or just flummoxing. So the note taking, the kind of commonplace element, is kind of part of the writing. It's not just a kind of big dump or midden of old favorites that I'm drawing on.
Right. It's so interesting that there's as you say, it's part of this project, it's part of this writing, but also it has something to do with the conditions by which you do your work. As you say, teaching and reading and writing, I review things as well, and that ends up creating its own sort of separate archive. One of my favorite parts in Essayism, which I love and admire so much, is you saying about your writing life that it proceeds from these deadlines, that you're not the kind of person that's just writing for as some people kind of pose their writing life, that there is a correlation between the duties of your life and what you tend to produce. Was this one of the first things that seemed to break that pattern? That it's like, now I'm just doing this for that it has no correlation to outer stimulus. It seems to have a freedom that it seems like a departure.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. In some respects, I mean, it turns out, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. It turns out I seem to be writing a trilogy that begins with essayism, that carries on with this book about sentences, and the next book is mostly about images. It's about a kind of idea of affinity to pictures, and I think it's definitely true that having spent years writing, you know, like you, writing to deadlines, writing to commissions, somehow that process also has like it's not inseparable from the public life of that kind of essayistic or journalistic writing, but it's like a kind of like secret track that runs alongside it, which is your notes, the thoughts that didn't make it into, you know, the published essay or review or lecture and so on. And somehow these books, Essayism first, and the sentence book maybe a little bit more so, feels like somehow a product of all of that, and at the same time, exactly as you say, kind of breaking out of it, because this book didn't have a plan. It could have gone in any kind of direction. I was kind of feeling my way from one piece to the next. And I like, you know, like many writers who do the kinds of things that we do, writing for magazines, journals, or teaching, I like short forms. I like writing to short forms. Yeah. But at the same time, this felt kind of uncontrollable as well, partly because my attraction, my like desire for these sentences might take me in kind of unpredictable and uncomfortable directions. I might suddenly find that because I'd written a sentence down in my notebook, and this was a kind of rule in writing the book, was that if I wrote a sentence in the notebook that was devoted to this book, then I had to write about it. So I suddenly found, oh no, I've never read Teresa Hack-Kyung-Cha, for example. I've never read Whitney Balliet, who wrote about jazz for the New Yorker. Suddenly I've discovered this writer, and now I have to find out something about them because this one sentence had somehow stuck, had kind of caught my ear, or it had stuck in the mind.
Yeah. So that's really exciting for me to hear that you're now turning your attention totally to images. But you talk even here, you know, in your section about a wonderful Didion caption in Vogue that has its own sort of journey through time. You talk about how images have helped your writing, and you can see that all through this book, how the discipline of writing about images is in some ways a tutorial in the sentence and how to direct its energies and its attentions. Did thinking about images play into the creation of this book?
That's such an interesting question. I think so. I think partly because my training is in literary criticism. You know, I have a degree in English and a PhD, and for a long time I thought I wanted to be a kind of conventional academic in that field. And then something else happened. I took a different kind of track, and I think that my a different training, another kind of education in paying attention for me. In fact, I sometimes think that this is how I learned to write about, you know, the world, about life as such, was writing about pictures, writing about images, writing art criticism. And I do think that there's something, and I thought about this when I embarked on Suppose a Sentence, was I don't really want this to be a work of literary criticism as such. Of course it is that in some respects, but I wanted it to be like the challenge which I have sometimes been presented with, and at Cabinet magazine, where I've been an editor for a long time, it's something that we're kind of quite accustomed to. We ask people to write about a single object or a single image. And I kind of think about writing about each of these sentences as a little bit like that challenge. You know, take a photograph by, I don't know, Atget or somebody, and say something. A newspaper photograph, something, a stray kind of piece of image dreck that you found on the internet. Do something with it, and I really like that challenge of focus on the one object. So it's really interesting to hear you say that somehow that has come across. You know, that there is this kind of sense that, because what is that difference when you write about an image or an object? I kind of think about it as a little bit like a kind of stupidity that you have to cultivate, you know, a kind of naivety and openness to the kind of brute facticity of things in a photograph, for example. And that's a kind of productive way for me to unlearn, for a while at least, a lot of my own training in literary criticism.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, just thinking about essayism, there's a wonderful chapter on lists and catalogs, and it's a similar thing, that you're in some way trying to get as much of the field of vision or the field of items or the sort of cabinet of curiosities into the sentence as all, especially the longer sentences here. We can talk about brevity versus length. The longer ones often aspire to that sort of completion that you want to get when you write about a photograph or you write about a painting. You're trying to pan back as much as you can and give a sort of gestalt, but also name everything.
Yeah, except that there are also those long sentences, and I think that this is particularly true of the kind of long Victorian sentence, the sentence in John Ruskin or George Eliot or De Quincey or Melville, for example, where the sentence is also just a kind of container. And Annie Dillard makes this point in an essay when she's talking about 19th century fiction and 19th century essays. She says, these great Victorians, they're not elegant. They write these long, supposedly kind of elegant and perfectly formed sentences. They're not. They're messy. They're baggy. To use Henry James's word. They're containers for all kinds of treasures, but also rubbish. And I suppose that's the kind of attraction as well to those long sentences, is that they're unruly.
Yeah. Speaking of the sort of container nature of the sentence, how did you approach, and at least from my perspective, I saw you kind of in sometimes leaning into this and sometimes pulling against it, the sentence as container or artifact of personality or of style, I guess. That there were moments where you had sort of painted beautifully the conditions of the sentence's creation. And in some ways it freezes not only that great container in place, but the person too. How did you deal with autobiography, the person, the maker of the sentence, and the sentence itself?
God, what an interesting question. It wasn't a kind of wasn't a distinction that I was kind of aware of while I was writing. I think each sentence kind of took me by surprise, in the sense that there were some that I really thought, I'm going to stick to the thing itself. I'm going to stick to its kind of syntax and structure and tone and so on. And I would find myself kind of wandering off, giving a lot more biographical background or detail. Maybe Didion is a kind of good example in answer to that question, which is that, and I think I sort of start and end the Didion chapter by talking about what seems like a really recognizable Didion-ness in a sentence, right? And the sentence, and you alluded to this earlier, the sentence that I focus on is an anonymous photo caption that she wrote for Vogue in 1965.
Would you like to comment before we talk about it?
Yeah, let's hear this sentence. This is one version of the sentence. And this is the first version of the Didion sentence that I came across. And I say the first version for reasons that I'll maybe explain in a moment. And it simply goes like this: opposite, above, all through the house, color, verve, improvised treasures in happy but anomalous coexistence. And so this photo caption, which accompanies a feature about Dennis Hopper, Didion revisits in, I think it's 1980, when she publishes this very short collection of her three short stories. And she gives this as an example of her early writing. She gives it as an example of her youthful trainee writer self. This is what she was trained in, this kind of act of compression. And in interviews, she talks about her being edited at Vogue, and the process of, as her editor said, we wrote long and we published short, and that's how Joan became a writer. So there's part of a kind of self-mythologizing as well as a kind of legend of Didion that we all sort of buy into as well. The legend of a particular kind of discipline and rigor. And another part of that discipline is the famous retyping and rehearing and inhabiting of passages of Hemingway, right?
Yeah.
So it's part of a kind of part of a self-image maybe, but also part of a legend that seems very attractive. Didion rewrote that caption when she quoted it 25 years later. And that's really, sorry, not 25 years later, about 15 years later. That's really fascinating to me, because here is a writer who is maybe, and it's kind of undecidable, only Joan Didion could tell us, either she has corrected herself because she really actually wants to improve this sentence when it reappears, or there's something much more mysterious going on about a kind of judgment of her earlier self and a kind of empathy with her earlier self as well. So that's I think a sort of good example where actually in that chapter the biographical details are a bit sparse, but I hope that there's a kind of sense of one of those things that I suppose for every writer, you know, it's not unusual for a writer, I think, especially maybe a writer who writes for magazines and periodicals and stuff, to have these examples of our earlier selves still hanging around, you know, to hand. I could probably right now put my hand on versions of my writing self from 20 years ago in old magazines and so on. And to have that self kind of dispersed in that way is a very particular way of living as a writer.
Yeah,
it's quite different from some of the novelists, you know, the Eliot, for example.
You know, there's a mirror of that dispersal. Of course, you know, the reading self does, in some ways, does the same thing. And I found myself wondering, well, I'll read one of your sentences to you and I'll tell you what it is, sorry, I thought I had it and I don't. It's in your wonderful section or a piece about Elizabeth Bowen. You say, as I write, I'm 2/3 of the way through A Time in Rome, which she published in 1960. And I think I have found again a writer after my heart. How many times does it happen? Dare it happen in a life of reading? A dozen maybe? I thought that was so wonderful. And earlier in that piece, you talked about how you were embarrassed about the circumstances under which you hadn't read her earlier. Did you learn anything about your taste in writing this?
Oh, yeah, good, very good question. I confirmed something about my taste, which is that I think that most of the sentences have a particular combination of a sort of roundedness and elegance and polishedness, and at the same time some element that's kind of undoing that. Mm-hmm. That's kind of either messy around the edges, or there is some element. It might be a single word, for example, or it's a particular turn of syntax or grammar or punctuation that's somehow kind of undoing things. It turns out that I don't seem, or at least in the, you know, in a way, this book is such a kind of a snapshot and an accident in a way. You know, a version of this book written a year later would be utterly different, right? But if you take it as some kind of snapshot of taste or affinity or sensibility, there are very few sentences in the book that don't have that kind of element of awkwardness about them. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe not surprising to me, but I somehow thought that I would, in a book about great sentences, I would want to tackle things that were somehow more, that felt more sure of themselves, you know, than the Nabokov sentence. You know, though even Nabokov said, you know, some sentences need to be just kind of serviceable and dull and just do their job. Yeah. Or the kind of very even, perfectly modulated, ironic Jane Austen sentence is not there. So I suppose if I learned anything about my taste, it is that you can't help being yourself, really. There are writers I definitely feel like I thought I had a duty to include, like Proust, for example, or Joyce, and they're not there. But what's also not there, I think, is a kind of a sentence that feels slightly too sure of itself, and maybe there's a kind of essayistic version of that as much as there is a kind of a novelistic one. There are no zingers in this book, you know.
Yeah.
Although James Baldwin kind of almost gets there, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny what you do with James Baldwin. I would love for everyone to, I mean, maybe we could talk about this, how you, on that, you give the circumstances again of this tiff between Baldwin and Mailer, and then go on this, you can't call it anything but a kind of jazz riff on just the word ofe, which is to me the funniest of the sort of Black words for white people. I've like really thought about this a lot. Ofe, honky, all we can go down. And you just expand on this one thing and make it less of a quip than it is, because you now packed it with so much potential meaning.
Well, it seems, should we just hear that sentence?
Sure, absolutely.
Just so that people have a sense of what we're dealing with here. So this is Baldwin from 61, as far as I recall, in response to a number of Mailer's essays. And Baldwin is recalling a period in the mid-50s when he had got to know Mailer and considered him a friend. And he's describing at this point Mailer's efforts to ingratiate himself with the Black American jazz musicians living in Paris at that stage. And Baldwin says they're having none of it, of Baldwin's ingratiating. And he says, they thought he was a real sweet au fait cat, but a little frantic. And on one level, I just love the slinky kind of slowness of the first part, the first third of that sentence. They thought he was a real sweet au fait cat, comma, but a little frantic. And frantic seems just like such a perfect encapsulation of so much about Norman Mailer. Yeah. But I was interested in the word, and because it's a word that is unfamiliar in a kind of, you know, an Anglo context, it's a word that I knew from reading various writers, especially writers about jazz and about the cultures around jazz in the 20th century. And I was familiar with it as something that, you know, in Billie Holiday's autobiography, for example, it's a word used to describe audience and a white audience and so on. So it was something that I had some familiarity with, but you leap into the word and follow it even just a little bit in terms of its history and controversies around whether the degree to which it was freighted with insult or was kind of a neutral term for some writers early in the 20th century and so on. So I was just really interested in the fact that Baldwin, who says in the same essay, when he uses the word hip, he says, and I'm choosing my words carefully, or I'm being careful about my words, something like that. That au fait, hip, cool, these very loaded mid-century terms are having this kind of dance in that essay, because hip, of course, is the word that Mailer wants to appropriate for himself. And Baldwin seems to be kind of deploying and weighing these words in such a very precise and kind of subtle, and also in that sentence, funny way.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you to read one more sentence, but first I'm going to read one of your sentences after it. In response to a sentence by Gertrude Stein, which I hope that you'll read. You say, and this, I'll read it and then I'll ask. Sorry. And at the same time being repeated and varied, suppose and supposing, the word flies away from the fixity of objects into a realm of elusive abstraction. It is exactly, and to me this is, you know, this perked me up just in terms of this question of taste and sensibility and affinity and everything else. It is exactly what I want from a sentence. This combination of oblique self-involvement and utter commitment to the things themselves. For words are also things, and things are apt to burst with force and loud report. Beautiful. I wondered if writing this brought to your attention, or sort of brought to higher attention generally, what seems to me the inner problem of the sentence between sound and sense. Was that, I mean, this Gertrude Stein is, I think, you know, she's the monarch of that problem.
Yeah.
Was that something that you thought about increasingly as you wrote this?
Yeah, thought about, or maybe kind of felt my way around in a slightly not so conscious or not so kind of deliberate way. Stein is, in some respects, she's a test for some readers, isn't she? I mean, yeah. Even though I think of Stein as working exactly on the kind of cusp that sentence you just read describes, that there is this kind of complete commitment to sound and rhythm and to its delirium, and on the other hand, absolutely, especially in something like Tender Buttons, for example, such an absolute precise kind of commitment to the thing, to the object, to describing things in as intimate a way as possible. But she still remains, for some people, kind of really beyond the pale and a writer of nonsense. And so I suppose one of the things that I realized as I was writing this was that some readers just would not see or hear what I was talking about. You know, and I'm sure that this is true. Some readers will read the sentence that in fact is on the next page after the Stein, which is this long Virginia Woolf sentence from her essay on being ill, which to me is just this perfectly weighted, beautiful architectural, but also kind of slippery and mysterious in its interior sentence. To many people, I'm quite sure will just seem vastly irritating and self-involved. And so that distinction, or that the relationship between sound and sense, is also so subjective.
Yeah. I'd actually love to ask you about Virginia Woolf, because, you know, and I think this, you know, now hearing you talk about this in closer conversation with essayism is very relieving to me, because I did not want to be reading you unfairly in that way, because I definitely think of them, was reading it, thought of them as of a piece. And both of them share this approach of a kind of cloud of witnesses, that they draw, as you move forward, there's still reference back to somebody that you mentioned before, a sentence that you mentioned before, or work that you mentioned before, and sometimes it works in the other direction. There's a sort of foreshadow of something that then we read, and all this, we're more acquainted with it than we would be because we've read it in the order that you set up. But to me, it always seems like your chief witness, in some ways, you're the second critic over your shoulder is Woolf. And I would just, partially maybe it's because of the range of things that she wrote about. So there's always a Woolfism to put in. But she seems to me to be so closely your companion, especially in this. I would just love if you could talk about her influence and presence in this book.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, the writer that I own up to in the book, saying, you know, this is actually the writer, you know, who, without whom, you know, etc., is Roland Barthes.
Right.
And maybe, and I wouldn't be the only person for whom this is true. You know, I'm sure that this is perhaps true for, you know, Wayne Kestenbaum, for example, who's somebody else I referred to a couple of times. That Woolf and Barthes are kind of cousins, you know, in a certain kind of, how would one describe it? For me, it's a particular kind of obliquity, a certain kind of subtlety of approach to the most kind of actually material and intimate kind of description. Woolf is so, I'm reading or rereading for the first time in about 20 years right now, Woolf's Orlando, which has a texture that is so different and so much in some respects even more gorgeous and strange than her more conventional novels. And realizing that it's actually surprising that I'm so attached to her in some respects. In the Elizabeth Bowen chapter that you talked about earlier, I briefly kind of described this moment when I was a student, where I sort of somehow chose between Woolf and Elizabeth Bowen. As growing up in Ireland, studying in Dublin, it should have been Elizabeth Bowen that grabbed my attention at that point, and for some reason it was Woolf. And I think it is again this kind of combination of a sense of mastery. And one of the things about Woolf, as you say, exactly, writing about so many things, you know, she was such a kind of accomplished and diverse and kind of apparently amenable essayist and journalist. You know, she would turn her hand to writing about so many different things. So there is this kind of mastery, and at the same time, this sense of things always kind of slipping away from her. And the essay on being ill, she writes this essay for T.S. Eliot for an issue of the New Criterion, the journal that he was editing, and it's absolutely the product of a period of intense physical and emotional kind of suffering. And it comes out so perfectly rounded and polished and designed, and at the same time has this absolutely yawning kind of chasm of sorrow under it. And I guess it's again that kind of combination of something so beautifully made and completely falling apart, which I realize is exactly how I was describing the essay in Essayism as well. So this is almost like a motif that keeps coming back. Maybe this comes back in the Images book in the next year or two as well. But it's that kind of that seems inescapable in her. And I think that might be what I first found when I read her, you know, as a teenager. The Waves was the first book of hers that I read, and the sense of maintaining this like high wire act of movement between different voices, but somehow absolutely collapsing into the particularity of each one. Just to finish, the image that she uses about this is she talks about in her diary about tunneling back behind her characters. So it's that sense that there is this kind of like chasm or void underneath this beautifully made surface that I suppose is really attractive for whatever reason.
I want to go back to this issue of sound, because it's something that I, perhaps because of my childhood of being, you know, preached to in churches, I'm always interested in this, what is the effect of the sentence said out loud as opposed to read, as opposed to written down. And I thought, interestingly, there are a couple sentences here, perhaps my favorite and most pithy of which is Shakespeare's "Oh, oh, oh," which comes back in several of the plays, but also a sentence by John Donne, which is part of a sermon, and also a sentence by John Ruskin, which I imagine would have been hard to say. It's a longer, more sort of complex sentence, but that comes about through a lecture. Did the sort of sonic nature of these sentences and their potential delivery out loud change your idea of them as sentences?
Oddly, it didn't, or in the sense that, I mean, I wasn't setting out when I chose them or wrote about them to consider the sentence and its oral delivery. In fact, quite early on in thinking about the book, I left out, and deliberately left out, for example, political speeches or rhetoric, or you know, movie dialogue or song lyrics and so on. I wanted to focus on the page. It turns out, as you say, that this other element, this spoken and performed element, has snuck in. And so that suggests to me that maybe that is actually how I think about the written sentence too, right? And it's, you know, we talked earlier about Stein. It's so hard for me to separate now when I read Stein, to separate what's on the page from the recordings that exist of her voice. And I think, you know, there is a writer many of whose great shorter writings are lectures. They are designed to be intoned. They're designed to be heard. And I suppose I think that's something that having, in my 20s been as I said earlier, been a graduate student and planned or hoped for some kind of academic career, the moment that I started writing professionally, which in my case meant writing kind of very tiny book reviews for Time Out magazine in London, things about that size, kind of size of a bus ticket, was that I started trying to hear other people's prose, because I was trying to, I suppose I suddenly thought of writing in an oral way that I had never really experienced before, and so maybe looking back and kind of plucking some of these sentences from my reading in the past, and maybe thinking about the way that I read now, there is that element of performance, and of hearing something. And of course, it's what I say to my writing students all the time: read your stuff out loud, hear it, move your lips when you're reading, do all the things that encourage this level of a kind of naive and oral experience of what's on the page, if that makes sense.
It does. And it also, I mean, there's something in that, the voice and on some level the oral nature of the sentence that also makes me think of this book's sort of technical being, which I think it's so hard, right? Because this sentence by its nature stakes out territory, right? It is its subject in some way, right? And so I guess this is just what criticism is the writing around and writing next to, and writing in harmony with, I guess, if you are still thinking about sonics and all this. I just want to read a sentence just because I love it so much. It's in response to a John Ruskin sentence about clouds and sky and a storm, and you talk about how this has been a motif with him all along. And it seems to me, kind of staking some territory next to what he's already staked out: formed and unformed, distinct and dissolving. The cloud was pure etheric becoming, but arrested in the sky, or at least appearing so. Clouds apprehended, clouds drawn, painted or described in writing. Even before the arrival of photography, these were the film stills of the Romantic era. I guess this is a question about criticism. How do you think about the jangle of your sentences next to these sentences as you pluck them out? What's the method of approach there?
I think it's partly method. It's partly a sense of kind of doggedly trying to kind of track, the context of a sentence, or to think about its structure in a kind of technical way. Although the book has ended up a lot less technical actually than I imagined it would. But it's also a kind of unthinking, I think. A lot of what I'm doing here, I think, is quite intuitive and driven by trying, I suppose, sometimes to kind of get into a state of mind that somehow, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, that sort of matches or runs alongside the sentence or the text. It might be a sentence, it might be a poem, it might be another sort of text that you're writing about, that you're on a kind of parallel track with it. And maybe that involves a kind of mimesis, it involves a kind of imitation of the thing itself. And that in itself is a kind of critical act, It's imitatio is a kind of ancient rhetorical training. You learn you repeat the thing that you're studying in order to understand it. But it's also, I suppose, trying to kind of reach a state of mind where you might just as easily drift away, but somehow you're kind of marked by the language or the feeling that you first found in this thing. I don't think a particularly, and maybe this is why I didn't end up an academic is, I don't seem to have, although my training is in this area, I don't seem to have a very well worked out theoretical or kind of methodological attitude or approach in these pieces. They're doing something. I suppose the model for me in criticism and in how one does this would be somebody like Kestenbaum, whose kind of commitment to a sort of critical delirium or fugue state seems like really admirable to me, and something that that is really rare and worth hanging on to when one finds it in a critical writer.
Yeah,
it's a kind of it's giving up certain kinds of mastery, I think.
Right. I think that's a great place to move forward and ask other people's questions. So there are some stuff in there's some stuff in the Q&A box now. If other people have questions, you can start to send those. But there's one really interesting one, which is, can you speak to the difficulties or just the way you thought about it when you're considering translated sentences like Part or someone else? How did you, was that approach different?
Yeah, there are actually fewer translated sentences in the book than I imagined there might be when I first started. So I thought it would be a larger kind of question, and in a way, it's something I slightly regret, that it's not something that any of the essays kind of makes its real focus. But there are some moments that it became